All right, guys, we're going to get started here. So just a few things to kind of clarify, make sure everything's good. Every week before Monday lunchtime, you're expected to do a pre-week quiz, and that pre-week quiz is always based on whatever material is above it in that same kind of block. So like for week 1 was chapter 5, the notes and the videos of that. And then for the next week, it's going to be based on, I believe, chapter 6 and 7, and so on and so forth. The purpose of it, even though it's a one question, and sometimes it could be something that's based on something I said in the videos, sometimes it could be an application of what's been discussed in the videos. The goal behind it is to make sure you guys kind of keep up to speed, and that when you come here, you've seen this before. So that we don't have different levels of people, some people who've done all their work and some who haven't here. So as expected, I'm sure you guys know this already, but you're only expected to come here once a week, in the sense that like I have a group here today, Monday, and then I'll have another group on Thursday. And for the people wondering, well, what's going to be different? Well, it's pretty much the same. Like today and Thursday, I'm pretty much doing the same thing twice with 2 different groups. The only distinction that may happen is that on Thursday, depending on the students I have and the participation I have and the questions I have from the group, it's just going to direct the flow of the class slightly differently. But overall, it's the same kind of discussion, like it depends on who's with you in your classroom. For today, for the first week, I'll probably just kind of make sure that all the material is clear to you guys. So here, when we talk about chapter 5, everything that revolves around the calculation of GDP is very clear to you, and that the class is clear. But as we move on during the semester, the more we'll use some of this time to hopefully dive into some more meaningful and real life kind of applications revolving around macroeconomics. So hopefully we get to kind of like look at what's going on around the world and try to relate it to the information seen in the theory of this class. So that's kind of the goal of this kind of like in-class portion. But if you notice, well, there's a camera here. I'm recording this now. It's not live streamed, so I get to kind of edit it a little bit, but the big purpose of editing it is just to make the sound a little bit better. So on myself, I have a small microphone, and I just kind of like join the two together to make it sound better than just having this terrible sound that sometimes you'll have in these systems. So if ever you can't make it because you're sick or you have something else that day and you want to see it online, like I'll never be taking attendance. Like you guys choose to come. And then if ever you can't make it on Monday but you really want to make it in person, well, in both of my classes I have a few spots available. So if not everyone gets the same idea at the same time, and the same thing goes for the people who are registered online. If you want to show up at the class from time to time, most likely there'll be seats available for you. But if ever the class is absolutely full, well, obviously it's the people who are registered in that class will have priority, but I don't see that being an issue at all. So feel free to either come Mondays, Thursdays, or some weeks just doing it fully online. It's really up to you. If you do it fully online, you just won't be able to participate as much in terms of asking questions. But for the people who are doing it online that I'm speaking to right now as well, feel free to reach out and ask me questions beforehand. What I mean by that is that before the Monday, you're expected to have covered all the material for the week. And then you might have some questions that relate to that. Not necessarily the theory that you see in the notes, but real world applications around that. And if you ask me a really good question before, like right now, this time slot on the Monday, if you ask me before the Thursday, it's harder because I won't normally record the Thursday unless I screw up the Monday's recording for some reason. Because otherwise it'll just be redundant. But if you can ask me a question beforehand, and I have time in the class to kind of answer it or discuss that kind of application, I will. So if ever you guys can't make it, but you still find it interesting and you still want to participate, just ask me a question and I'll try to do my best to answer it here. I'll often cover in this kind of initial part, I'll cover any questions that you may have. So I'm expecting most people this week to be like more shy and maybe not have as much questions in terms of what wasn't really clear with the material. In my previous class, I had a few questions, but overall, I kind of covered what I thought were the big points to make sure that you're successful on future quizzes and future final exam. But at the end of the day, as we go, my goal, I've taught a hybrid type class in the past, and it was really cool, the applications that we could kind of discuss. Since I kind of expect you guys to cover more of the theory before coming to class, it allows more time to kind of go around different subjects. It's not as much kind of like just going through the material throughout the whole class time. Okay? So it's really what you guys want to make out of it, this in-class portion. If I get a sense that you guys just want to kind of see the theory again, that's what I'll do. But if I get a sense that some of you come up with really interesting questions and different things like that, that's how the class is going to go. That's why I say the Monday and the Thursday class is similar, but can be different depending on who's in your classroom with you and how the flow of the class goes. Okay? So, pre-week quizzes are clear. Every week you have to do one. So regardless if you're a Monday student, a Thursday student, or you're an online student, I kept it all equal. Everyone has to finish it before Monday lunchtime. So whether you bounce around, it doesn't matter. You'll always have the same deadline. For the Friday quiz, which happens every second week, roughly speaking, well, that quiz is online, and you have the whole 24-hour time block to do it. The Friday quiz compared to the pre-week quiz is actually longer. It's like 10 questions, and you have 20 minutes to complete it. So that's really trying to measure your understanding of the information, whereas the pre-week quiz is just kind of a quick question, can measure your understanding. It could also be based on something I said in the videos that if you've done the work and you've actually watched the videos, should be straightforward. Not saying mistakes don't happen and some people might have screwed up the question. That's fair. You can cancel out at least one of your quizzes. I might give more flexibility if the grades are too bad. But overall, you'll have like one of your quizzes, pre-week quizzes, that don't count. So if you didn't do it or you did it poorly the first one, don't worry about it too much. You could still do well. And for the online quizzes, you have 20 minutes and that whole 24-hour time block to do it. So if Fridays aren't good for you because you're working, well, if you're absolutely swamped the whole day, we'll figure something out and I'll give you an exception. But generally speaking, since I give you guys a whole 24-hour time block, normally there's no issues. You'll either do it early in the morning or later in the evening or during the day. It's really up to you. Okay. Any questions? Yeah.
It's only on Friday has to be, or before the Friday we can do it?
No, the weekly quizzes, the bi-weekly quizzes are just a Friday thing.
I saw like it's 18th September, and which one are you talking about?
So the 18th of September, which is a Friday, is a Friday quiz. Whereas the pre-week quiz, you have anywhere between the Tuesday and the following Monday to complete.
That's the one takes 2 minutes.
Yeah, exactly. I increased I gave you guys 2 minutes for the first pre-week quiz. I increased the future pre-week quizzes to 3 minutes, just in case you had kind of like a calculation-based question and it takes a little bit longer, just to make sure time's not an issue. Normally on an exam, you have 2 minutes per multiple choice. Like on the Friday quizzes, you have 20 minutes for 10 multiple choice. That's the normal ratio to have plenty of time. But I gave you guys a bit more time. The only thing is I don't want to make it unlimited because otherwise you look at the question and then you scan through the notes or you scan through the videos and try to find it. So normally my questions aren't easy to just scan through the PDF file. You actually have to have listened. So I might have to do with some of the graphs or some of the calculations done in the videos.
But this one you said 20 minutes or 24 hours?
Once you start the quiz, you have 20 minutes. And you can start the quiz any time in the 24-hour time block of the Friday.
Okay.
Yeah. There's no final exam. There's no midterm. There is a final exam. There's no midterm in this class. And the final exam is proctored online, but there's nothing special about that, if there's any questions.
Do we get to practice run for the final? Because it's online, it's a new system, you have to use webcam.
Yeah, you will. The final quiz will go through the proctorio completely. If you want, we can do the last 2 final quizzes, but I set it up that at least you'll have one practice run through the whole process. And answering that as well as the quiz or the final will be the same kind of procedure as any other ones on Moodle. That's just that extra step that's going to be required, but everything else is exactly the same. Like it's the same kind of template and everything. There might just be some development type questions, or I might just set them up as all multiple choice, but it's going to be the same kind of format. Cool. Any other questions? All right. So that's about the format of the class. And now about Chapter 5, GDP, Gross Domestic Product. In French, Produit Intérieur Brut. I just clarify that because I had a friend of mine who studied here and he failed macro twice because he couldn't make the link between what he learned in CEGEP, which was Produit Intérieur Brut, and what he learned here at Bishop's in English. If ever you're French trained, feel free to ask me questions. Like my mother tongue's actually French, and I wasn't French trained. I did college at Champlain, so in English as well. But I know most of the concepts in French as well. So if you're not really sure and you want to know, is this in French and in English, ask me and I'll be happy to help. So is there anything that needs to be clarified in this first kind of chapter for you guys? Everything went well? Everything's clear? So I guess the big things to note from this chapter is the whole idea of how GDP is calculated. So all the measures, your consumption, investment, government expenditures, and exports minus imports, or combined, that is net exports. That is one of the big topics, like every single part of it, like what it represents and how it affects GDP. And the other big part of it, which kind of gets repeated in some way, shape, or form in Chapter 6, revolves around nominal versus real GDP. And that whole discussion there is going to be used to calculate inflation using the GDP deflator approach. And then we'll be comparing that to inflation using the CPI approach. And that's the whole kind of discussion of this next chapter. And inflation calculation, you'll have questions on this kind of quiz. But on the final exam, or if there was a midterm, it's definitely a question that does come up all the time. So something that we'll cover a little bit more next week when we talk about the different inflation, ways to calculate inflation, distinctions between them. Okay? So, anything that's not clear here, or you just want me to talk about it broadly? Okay, so the big thing with GDP is used as a measure to try to see how the economy is doing. Okay? Why we calculate GDP, why does Canada and other countries calculate GDP? Well, they want to see how the economy is doing from one period to the next. So if you read the news, you'll hear about GDP on a yearly basis. You could also hear about GDP on a quarterly basis, like what was our production on the first quarter of 2020 versus the first quarter of 2019, second quarter, and so on. And what we're trying to see is we're trying to compare the value of our production from from one year to the next. We're trying to see how things are going. And essentially, what's being discussed at the end of this chapter is this idea that GDP should not necessarily be the ultimate goal for society. Like production and the value of all the things that we produce should not necessarily be the ultimate goal, because there's other things that are important in the economy. We could think about just mental health. We could think about environmental health, like how are forests doing, how are national parks doing, how are rivers doing. We could think about mortality rates. We could think about how people are dying of this disease, literacy rates. There's a lot of other things that are important just in how much is produced. But how much is produced is an easy metric to get a sense of how the economy is doing. Because the idea is that the more we produce, the more we can consume. Naturally, we trade with other countries, but the more we produce, if we weren't trading with other countries, it's easy to see, the more we produce, that means the more we can consume. So if we're producing shirts and cars and skateboards, whatever, like the more we have, the more each of us can enjoy. So the more productive we can get from one year to the next, that means the more that we can consume as well, which is a good thing if you think that consumption is good. And generally speaking, it is enjoyable to consume. But like I said, there's other parts to it than just that. But this is what we're trying to measure with GDP. We're trying to measure gross domestic product. And gross domestic product, the whole idea here is that we're measuring the value of all goods, all final goods to be more precise, produced in a country. Okay. That's what we're measuring. And like I said, when we'll be comparing the second quarter, or now we're in the third quarter of the year of 2020 to 2019, we're going to be able to see to what extent this pandemic has led to a reduction in production. And this reduction in production, what kind of repercussions will it have? And later on, we're going to see, well, if we're going through a situation where we're not at potential GDP, well, how can we get there? Later on in the semester, we're going to talk about this idea of potential output. How much can we be producing? And that discussion of potential output will deal with what happens if we're in a well-functioning economy where most people here are working and the few people that aren't working are just transitioning between jobs. They lost their jobs, there's plenty available, and they're just kind of looking around to find the perfect match. It's just a normal level of unemployment. We don't have anyone that's been searching for months and months and there's just nothing available. That's cyclical unemployment. We'll talk more about that later. But if we're in a well-functioning economy, how much are we producing? And then if we're producing less than that, if this year in 2020 we're producing less than we were in 2019, and it's not because there was a war and we've lost half our population, it's because there's a lot of people that are out of work. Well, what are the different ways we can do to restore the economy back to full employment? What kind of policies can we use? Should we drop the interest rate to increase investment and consumption? Should we inject money into the economy? Whether it's what Trudeau's doing, injecting money to certain individuals that might be suffering more, or helping out businesses, or should we be developing new projects, such as it's been underway for a long time, but if it wasn't, the extension of the 410, the highway nearby. When you introduce a big project like that, that is government finance, it leads to jobs being created, and those people that work are spending more money locally, which creates more jobs, and it just leads to this positive impact. Okay? But at the end of the day, we're evaluating the value of all final goods and services in a country to try to see the health of the economy, how well the economy is doing. So to understand this, we have to understand how it's calculated. So there's different methods of calculating GDP. They all lead to the exact same amount. It's just that some are slightly more complicated than the other. So the three main approaches are expenditure approach, income approach, and value-added approach. The income approach and the value-added approach are presented in the videos and very briefly discussed. But the one that we focus on in this class is the expenditure approach, and that's the one that's highlighted here. It's by adding up all of these components that we have the total value of production. So consumption, straightforward. I won't spend any time on it really, other than to say that when we consume, it increases GDP when we consume domestically produced products. The reason here I split net exports, which is these two together, into two, is to highlight that if you buy a pair of pants from Malaysia, Well, that pair of pants will count in consumption, but it will also count in imports. And because it counts as a positive and a negative at the same time, it cancels out and therefore has no impact on GDP, which makes sense because GDP is a measure of all final goods and services produced in Canada for Canadian GDP. So here I mentioned goods, but it has to have services as well. Okay. So if you buy something that's produced elsewhere, it shouldn't have an impact on our GDP. But if I buy a Canadian-made good, well, here consumption goes up. None of these other ones change. Therefore, GDP goes up. As I buy that pair of pants made in Canada, it has a positive impact on GDP. That's why when we're going through situations such as this pandemic and we try to uplift our economy, we encourage a lot more people to buy local. Because by buying local instead of imported goods, you're helping out the Canadian economy naturally. So the harder ones to grasp are not consumption, they're not government expenditure so much, but investment is one of the harder ones to grasp. So investment is there's inventory investment, there's plant and equipment, or like any kind of equipment. And there's a new residential structure. So I taught macroeconomics this spring/summer, and one of the final exam questions related to discussing the difference between what we call investment in this class versus what we call savings. And I'm going to kind of highlight that discussion right now, and I'll highlight it more as we go through the semester, because it's important to know. Because when you build kind of this theory, you want to have a common language. It's like speaking any other language out there. So when we talk about investment here, we're talking about like things that are tangible towards a business. If you're buying stocks and bonds, that is not considered investment in macroeconomics. That would be considered part of savings. So just an aside, like buying bonds, mutual funds, stocks, whatever, is considered savings, a form of savings. Savings / what we can call lending. Because when you do all of those, you're lending in some shape or form. We're going to kind of dissect a little bit more bonds and mutual funds and stocks in the future. But bonds, you're lending with kind of like an implied interest rate coming back to you over time. Mutual funds, this could be a mix of things managed by a fund manager. And stocks, you're owning part of a company. But when you own part of a company, you're kind of lending them money in return for getting some of the money back as the company grows. The value, the percentage of the company, if you have 1,000th of the company, which would be a really good position if the company is large, because it's normally don't have such a big portion of it. But if you have 1,000th of the company and the company doubles in value, well, your share of that company, that's why often stocks are known as share or shareholders. Well, your share of that company goes up as well. You still only have 1,000th, but it's worth more now because the company is worth more. But in those things, we kind of consider them as savings because you have money and you kind of give it to someone else for a certain amount of time, and your goal is to getting a certain return out of it. Whereas what we consider investing is when you're kind of like buying something which will help your business prosper. So if a buddy of mine is going back to school to become an arborist to cut down trees and everything else, well, if he buys a chainsaw or different types of equipment to be able to do his new career, well, that is part of investment. If you're really into video editing and becoming a YouTuber, well, if you buy a camera and you buy other thing that allows you to strive in that career, well, you're investing. You're kind of using money, you're borrowing money to buy a product. Even if you don't borrow because you've accumulated that money, you're using money to buy something to help you prosper. So this would be kind of like that plant and equipment. If you're buying or building a new power plant or a new factory, or you're buying equipment, machinery, computer, car, whatever is required for your business, you're investing. It's not for consumption purposes, it's for your business. New residential structure is just the first time that residences, houses are built, they count as investment. That, I can't say why they count as investment instead of consumption. That's just the way it is. That's just the way it's calculated. Yeah.
Is it the same thing as a government building? Would it also be considered as
a new building? If it's government owned, and I'm not sure if it'd be, if government building might be on the government expenditure. I'm not sure. It will count either way. And like, there's so many little specifics that I don't know the answer, and you won't be expected to know the answer in this class. I could dig into it if you're really interested, but I'd expect the government building to probably come under government expenditure if it's really government owned.
So it has to be residential structures only?
Yeah, to be part of the investment component. But any new building will help GDP. Okay? But anytime there's a resale of a product, that does not count. Because otherwise, you think about reselling the same product multiple times, it would make it seem as though we produced a lot. Coming back to the goal, once again, that GDP is to try to show how well the economy is functioning, how much we are producing. If you imagine every time a house gets sold, it increases GDP by the value of that house. Well, let's say I have a really nice house, I sell it, a month later that person sells it to someone else, a month later sells it to someone else, and it's sold 12 times in a year. Well, it would make it seem as though we produced a lot of goods and services, whereas we just took something and we changed ownership multiple times. That should not count. Used car as well does not count. Ownership in a company, shares don't count. The initial public offering can count, but the shares don't count. And then new cars count as part of consumption unless they're used for a company, then they'd be part of investment. But when you resell a car and it's used, you can't really count it again, because otherwise you're counting the same thing multiple twice. We don't want a double count. And this is why we're saying only final goods and services, because you don't want to count something that was used to make a product. So if I look at this table here, whatever that kind of wooden product that serves as the surface, and I don't know if it's plastic or metal for the legs, but all of those materials, if I were to count it in its raw form and then in its table form, I'm double counting the same product. Okay? But if I were to buy, let's say, a piece of plywood or something else to make a table myself, and that's the end of it for that kind of production process, then that piece of wood counts because it's the final product produced, officially speaking, from a government standpoint, the final product sold. But when that product is bought and then changed and then produces something else, it doesn't count. Okay? It's that whole idea of we don't want to count something twice. And the tricky one that people sometimes struggle with is this inventory investment. So the way to see this inventory investment is the idea that sometimes you produce things that just don't get sold in that same year. Okay? This week, Apple will release new products. In the next few weeks, they'll probably release a new iPhone. Sony's coming out with a new product. There's new things coming out. They might be producing a ton of them, but it might not all be consumed or sold in 2020. Some of it might be produced 2020, but only sold in 2021. Same thing goes for cars or other kind of products. So if you think that all of those products were produced in a given year, but purchased by someone in the following year, well, if they counted only in the year that they were purchased, it wouldn't make any sense. Because if they only count in that year, then if you produce a lot of things in one year and then everything gets sold in the following year because we're getting out of recession, people are starting to purchase again, it would make it seem like one year the GDP is really low and then the next year the GDP is through the roof. We always want to look at what's being produced. So on this idea of what's being produced, if a computer, a phone, a car, or anything else is produced in 2020 but is not sold in 2020, it is accumulated by that company in what we call their inventories, and therefore it still counts as part of GDP in what we know as inventory investment. They're not necessarily investing in their inventories, but they're accumulating inventories. That's what it means. So for anyone that ends up studying in accounting and you get to look at a balance sheet, you'll see on the balance sheet it shows at a specific time like what's their accumulated cash, accounts receivable, and then there'll probably be investment somewhere lower down. And that investment tells you, not investment, but inventory, sorry. That inventory somewhere there will tell you how much stuff they accumulated. So if I sell kind of these markers, how many of these markers I've accumulated in 2020 and it is ready to be sold in 2021. I need to account for it.
Are you going to count it at full price in the inventory or only the price of the material?
Yeah, that's the interesting part. I had that question recently and I didn't have time to look into it. And it's a really good question. My impression is to get this information here, you're looking at often the financial statement. So you're kind of recording it at the value that the business is recorded at. In the sense that if I'm producing pens, I might not record it as inventory at the value at which I sell it for. Yeah.
When you're counting,
you have the answer or no?
No.
Okay, I was hoping you had the answer.
Sorry to disappoint you.
That's fine.
Say you have a business selling a product that obviously like they are sort of acting as a middleman,
Yeah.
like a bicycle store,
Yeah.
for instance. They obviously did not. They purchased bicycles from a company. So is that purchase counted, or is it the sale from business to consumer?
So my impression for that one would be similar to the baker kind of example. The baker who buys the wheat and buys the other ingredients to make bread and then sells the bread, we count the bread. We don't count the ingredients. The person who buys a bike from a producer, but the producer doesn't sell direct to the people, it sells to this guy and this guy sells to the people. Well, he's not changing the product the same way a baker is changing the ingredients to form bread, but he's distributing this product and therefore adding some value to the product in terms of its availability, and it's that final product that counts towards GDP. So not both times, or else they double count. So whatever price they sell it to the bike salesman and then he sells it, you don't count the first one, you only count the second one. You always count the final one. Here. Yeah. Yeah.
My question is, how can you really trust the calculations of GDP if, like in the Economist article, they talked about expanding the boundaries of what we calculate into GDP? And like, for me, obviously it makes sense to have a growing GDP and just add more things to the boundaries because that's just politically popular to be expanded the GDP every year, right? That's good. That's good.
Can you give me an example of how to expand the GDP? Like,
in the article they mentioned like you could use like research and development and all the money that goes into that could be an example of how you could expand the boundaries.
Yeah. Okay. So,
like intellectual property?
Yeah, well, different things that are kind of like some form of investment, like research and development, I could understand that. But at the end of the day, even if you kind of expand the boundaries, what we're interested in is not necessarily the absolute value of GDP, but its trend. And normally, if you were to change something, you would kind of not look at only now and into the future, but you could also backtrack and say, well, if we were to include that in the past, what would the trend be like? So for me, that kind of question relates more to what you'll see in the next chapter when you'll learn how to calculate inflation using the CPI approach. Well, if we change the basket of goods that consists of what a typical consumer consumes, and we were to add certain products that weren't consumed before and so on, it could have a certain impact on inflation. But as soon as you change it, you're kind of like, that's your new baseline for the future. And if you want to compare this current baseline and the future baseline, you want to kind of use the same definition in the past. So for me, if we include research in development or not, and GDP is not what's important, the absolute value is not what's important as much as how that's changing over time. And more precisely, would be personally interested in not GDP, but GDP per capita. GDP per capita is how much is produced in Canada per person. And to be more precise, we're going to talk about nominal versus real GDP. Well, it'll be real GDP per capita. You're removing that inflation component, and you're seeing per individual that is possible to work, like how many units, how much value is created from one year to the next, and see what trend that gives. So, like, there's always going to be some form of manipulation for political gain, and we'll talk about manipulation when we come to unemployment. It might be a small issue in GDP. I've never heard of that before, and if you want to send me like the article or something else, I'd be happy to look into it. But at the end of the day, like, it's not really a question of do we have GDP of 30 billion and last year we had 29. It's more like what's going on with it. And if you're going to change the definition, you shouldn't just change it for this year. You should rethink or recalculate previous years one to make it more fair. Or else if you're changing the definition all the time, it's not going to be fair. And it's not going to show a trend, let's say. Yeah.
Is that not reflected in consumption though?
What?
R&D or intellectual property, because that cost is passed on to the consumer.
Yeah, but I could understand the idea of potentially calculating it before, because R&D, like similar to inventory investment, you could kind of incur that cost for many years, and then it kind of brings to fruition later on. So if you want to kind of see where that cost happened. So yeah, it's a tricky one for sure. Yeah. Any other question? But
a question about like mass production.
yeah.
Like for example, if a company is creating like chips for phones, do they count those chips as final products?
If they're getting produced in a phone afterwards, no, they don't count it as a final product. The tricky part, and like this we don't discuss too much, and like you could see that it could get really tricky really fast, is when you introduce many countries. Like, because if a chip gets produced in one country and then the phone gets produced somewhere else, well, that chip was a final good coming out of one country, but was an intermediate good into another country.
So if it like goes to one company, then that company is like bringing in a lot of GDP as well because it's only going to one place, and you haven't like handling inflation to one place. So
Yeah.
Balance out by
yeah.
exporting afterwards.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a little bit more tricky, that part. But yeah, there's a lot of trickiness going on to it. The biggest thing is just understanding the baseline. Like, we're kind of expanding on it. It's super interesting. And that's what I kind of encourage in this in-class class, these kind of like expanded discussions that we can have. But yeah, I don't think you have to go too deep into it for now. Any other questions or comments? No? Okay. And then government spending. So government spending is in like different projects, but it could be in salaries of different people as well. Exports and imports. So like I mentioned, I talked about imports with consumption, but anytime you import a product, even if it counts in another category, it kind of like cancels out because an imported good is not produced in Canada and should not count towards Canadian GDP. Okay. All right. Any questions here? No? Okay, so nominal versus real. Nominal versus real is an important concept to understand, because it's a concept that will not only apply to GDP, it will apply to any other kind of discussion, whether it's interest rates. And this whole idea of nominal versus real, we have to kind of look at it and try to understand it a little bit better. So nominal, I like to see it as what I see. You'll understand what I mean by that in a second. And real is when we remove inflation. It's not necessarily quantity. It's still value. In both cases, we're still talking about a value. Yeah, it's still in dollar terms in both cases. So the way I see it, if I think of nominal GDP, well, if you think about going to a grocery store or anywhere else, and you look at your bill, you'll see how many articles you bought, what's the current price, and what's your total bill. Anywhere you go, like grocery store or any other place that you might be buying product, you'll see that kind of relationship there. And whatever is added to your credit card, what you see is that nominal GDP. When we'll talk about interest rates later on, the interest rate that you see, if you see on your credit card, you're charged 18%, that is your nominal interest rate. You get a mortgage, you're charged 3%, that is your nominal interest rate. The real, on the other hand, is you're trying to remove this inflation component. So let's say we have like a series of years. We had 2018, 2019, and now we're in 2020. And we want to compare the value of what's been produced in 2018 versus 2019 versus 2020. Well, to understand and to kind of see this trend, if we just look at the bills, so let's say you think about going to the grocery store. Like, we'll talk about this more when we come into CPI, but let's say you go to the grocery store and one year whatever you bought costs $100, next year it's $110, and next year is $120. Is it because you're buying more food? Is it because the food's becoming expensive? If you just compare what you spent in 2018, 2019, and 2020, and you see the value going up, it could be one of two things, or both together. So is this change here due to a change in quantity or a change in price? I'm not sure. Could be a mixture of the two. Okay? So what we try to do with real GDP is we try to remove, well, we don't try, we remove the impact of inflation, so we remove this price difference. We're not going back to quantity by saying that there is no price. That's not true. It's still, we're looking at the value of final goods and services produced. It's still a value, a dollar term. However, we remove the inflation component from one year to the next. How do we do this? Well, to remove the inflation impact, we use a base year for the prices. So regardless of looking at GDP from 2018, 2019, and 2020, for all of those productions of all of those years, we're looking at every single good and services that was produced, but we're using a set list of prices. That list of prices could be the prices that were present in 2018, could be prices present in 2019, 2020, it could be even prices present in 2010. Doesn't really matter, but you're using a set year as a baseline for your prices. So with this base year for the prices, every time you compare, if I have this, let's say this was nominal GDP, and this was for 2018, 2019, 2020, as I mentioned, I don't know if it's a change in quantity or price. But if, on the other hand, real GDP in 2018 was 100, and then in 2019 was 104, and then 112 in 2020. Well, that trend here in real GDP, I know, is only based on changes in output, changes in production, changes in quantity. those are all synonyms. Like I'm saying the same thing 3 times here. Just making sure that you understand that a change in quantity could be known as a change in output or a change in production. Any of those words can be used interchangeably, so any one works. But because I'm removing the inflation impact, because I'm using a base year for the prices, I know that if I'm using the same prices for all of the years, and I could see that the value of my production has gone from 100 to 104, I have to have produced more goods. Maybe there's certain industries that have gone down and some gone up, or they've all gone up by a little bit, by let's say 4% in this case, but the value of my production from one year to the next has increased. And then it's increased even more. But if over here I would have gone from 104 to 102, I would have seen that from one year to the next, my value of my production would have gone up, and then it would have gone back down. This is something I wouldn't be surprised to see in 2020. Like 2018, everything goes well, slight growth to 2019, and then COVID hits, and all of a sudden our production kind of slumps down a little bit. Okay? In real terms, when we say in real terms, the big thing when you hear the word real terms is what we're saying is we're removing the inflation impact. That's what in real terms means. Trying to remove that impact that could kind of skew our perception. Because otherwise, if we were looking, let's say this was GDP and this is in millions or billions or whatever, and we go from 100 to 110 to 120, you think, well, the economy is doing great. Every year we're doing better. We are producing more and more value. Yes, there's more and more value being produced, but from one year to the next, this increase of 10 million in value, well, 4 million of it was attributed to an increase in output, but 6 million of that increase is based on an increase in prices. So we've had 6% inflation from one year to the next. And then the next year, we see what seems to be an increase of production by 10 million, but in fact, we've dropped our production level by 2 million, so it's been like 12 million that is only based on changes in prices, inflation only. Because the economy is not doing so well due to COVID that maybe some countries are just pumping a lot of money into the economy and trying to make it recover as quickly as possible. And by pumping a lot of money into the economy might lead to high levels of inflation. And if that happens, we get this impression by looking at nominal only that the economy is growing, but it's not. The value is growing, but the value is skewed because inflation kind of, having inflation glasses on makes you give the impression that the economy is growing where it's not in real terms. So that's why the real component is important to know in this class, because it helps you paint a better picture. Okay? Later on, we're going to talk about nominal versus real interest rate. And the real interest rate is just going to be nominal minus inflation. And it's going to help us understand the real cost of borrowing. We'll come back to that later, but it's an important concept to have the ability to remove that impact of inflation. Yes?
What purpose does nominal GDP serve as a statistic?
So nominal GDP, the year, so that's a good question. The year that you choose as your base year, like 2018, let's say we're using the prices of 2018. Well, when you use that year 2018 and you have the quantities from 2018, your nominal is equal to your real GDP. And so in that respect, it's you'll always have kind of like a certain value to it. There's always going to be one year that you use as your base year, and that year's prices will be the prices that were reflected that year, so that nominal GDP can be your baseline. But then afterwards, all you want to do is, as you're looking at the trend, you want to make sure you remove that inflation impact, so you're looking at real GDP. But in reality, like even though you're interested in seeing changes in production, what you see when you go to the groceries, when you go elsewhere, is that nominal GDP. That's what you observe. So it's there, it's present. You wouldn't be able to get real GDP without having nominal GDP in a certain way. So it has value. And when we're going to come to calculating inflation, this next chapter, well, to calculate inflation, you're going to have this calculation that has nominal over real for a same year. Like it's going to be the same year's production minus 1 times 100 will give you your inflation for that year. So like this could be like nominal for 2019 and real for 2019. So you're using the production level of 2019 in both cases. One of them, you're keeping the inflation impact. The other one is the inflation is removed. By having the inflation impact over the inflation removed, you're extracting the percentage that is due to inflation. And that helps you calculate inflation. So in terms of trends, I agree with you that nominal is less useful if you want to look at trends and how production's going, but otherwise nominal has some value for sure. Yeah.
Is there a point where output, like, if your amount of output is high enough, it doesn't really matter about like inflation?
No, I don't see what you mean by that. Can you kind of elaborate a little bit more, because I don't see how that.
Like, if we're measuring GDP,
Yeah.
it's all about production.
Yeah.
And production is how we measure. I know we mentioned inflation, but like production is how we measure the success of
Yeah.
the country,
Mhm.
per se.
Yeah.
If your production is high enough, is there a point where it doesn't really matter of the other factors?
No, you'll never reach that point. Like there's points of production that we have now that 100 years or 200 years ago they would have never thought possible. We're producing a lot more, we're consuming a lot more than was ever imagined 200 years ago for sure. Like no one would have ever expected that every household, almost every individual has a car and everything else. You know, so we're producing a lot more than would have been expected not so long ago. But if you kind of disregard everything else, it wouldn't make any sense. It will always be regarded, no matter how productive your country is, you'll always be looking at all the factors. Yeah.
But what happens if you produce so much that the value of the product goes down? Like dumping, like oftentimes, like.
Well, so here we're always, when we produce in this kind of GDP, we're looking at the value of all final goods and services produced. So if you produce a certain good to a point where there's not much value to it, it's not really intelligent from a business standpoint, and it's not really intelligent from a government standpoint, unless you're trying to crush the competition. Like dumping is often related to a company that just tries to produce so much that other companies can't compete, they go out of business, and then they can jack up the prices again. That's a totally different ballgame. But if you were to just produce things to the point where you can't get much for it, it's not really a nice business practice. Like I wouldn't expect Apple to produce so many iPhones that they'll be struggle selling them for $10 because everyone has 5 already, you know? So like it doesn't make any sense. Like, so that wouldn't happen unless the only time dumping makes sense and is illegal is when you do it to crush your competition. Yeah. Anyone else? Yeah.
Why is that formula called the GDP deflator?
I don't know why it got coined that way, but it kind of deflates GDP and kind of tries to extract the inflation component. I don't know the history of it, to be honest. Yeah. And like, why grow? I don't know. Like all the words that they use, it's just things that they chose, I guess, over time. Yeah. Anything else? Is everyone good with calculating nominal and real GDP? It's something that you'll have to be good at. We'll kind of probably see it again when we go through inflation. The big thing that's important that I could kind of highlight from nominal and real GDP and same thing with calculating the basket of a good from one country and from one year to the next and calculating inflation through it is that the weight is important. What I mean there is in the examples that you'll have in class, they're always simplified examples. You wouldn't have time to calculate all of GDP for a country. Like it would take forever on an exam. So it's always going to be simplified examples. And by simplified examples, you'll often have like 2, 3 maybe goods that are either consumed or produced. And sometimes it will be the same goods that are produced and consumed. Sometimes it'll be a mix. But at the end of the day, what is important is you need to consider the weight. The errors I sometimes see when calculating GDP or calculating inflation using this basket of goods is that person will just kind of add, let's say we have 3 goods and one good costs like $5 one year, $5, and then the next year 7, the second good cost 12, and then 13, and then 6 and 8. And they'll just say, okay, 5 plus 12 plus 6 is 23, and then this is another amount, 28 over 23, and then calculate out inflation. But if you just use the prices, what you're inherently assuming is that for each of the goods, you're consuming 1 unit. And for each of the goods, if you're consuming 1 unit or producing 1 unit, you have an equal weight for each, which is not the case. Typically on my exams, I'll never have that the production or the consumption is completely equal for all 3 goods. It'll never be the case. And that's why there is a distinction as well between like GDP production and CPI production on an exam, is that because you'll have different weights, even though you might be dealing with the same 3 goods, and I could say that this good has gone up by, let's say, 40% more or less in price, this one a little less than 10%, and this one about 33% in price. So my general inflation has to be somewhere between 10 and 40% is what I would expect for the combined effect. Well, it's going to be different if I assume that I'm producing 100 of these units and only 2 and 1 of these units, than if I assume that I only produce 1 and 1 and 100 of this unit. Okay? The more you produce something, the more you are impacted by a change of its price, the more you consume of something. Let's say you buy something, like I'm kind of jumping into CPI inflation, but let's say you buy something every year or so, like it's a very rare purchase that you make, like a champagne for New Year's to pop the bottle or something else. Well, that price of the champagne that goes up by 10%, it's not going to have as big of an impact for you than if you buy beer every week and that goes up 10%, because that's a recurring purchase. A lot more of your spending for the whole year goes into that good, so you are more impacted by an increase in the price of that specific good. Weights matter. So it's just something to keep in mind when doing that. So make sure when you calculate nominal and real, you're always multiplying price and quantity. The difference between nominal and real is nominal, you will always use the same year's price than the quantity that you're referring to. So if we're talking about 2018, these are the quantities from 2018. These will also be the prices of 2018, because nominal is always same year's price and quantity. It's your bill that you see. Whereas real GDP, except for the year that you're looking at, real GDP for the year that you're using as your baseline for prices, any other year, the price and the quantity will be from separate years. So real GDP for 2019, using 2018's prices, you're multiplying the quantities from 2019 to the price of that same good in 2018. That's the big thing that you're doing, and you're removing that inflation component. Okay? Any questions? No? All right. I guess that's the biggest kind of things I wanted to clarify for these chapters here, and we kind of got into some interesting discussions. So if there's no more questions, we could split now and reconvene on next Monday. But if you have any questions, and I know the first week some people like to come see me after class, so if you want to come see me and speak individually, come see me. And if ever you have technical glitches for the first few weeks, like I'll be like super supportive of you guys for the first week. If you missed a pre-week quiz, like I'll maybe not count like the worst 2 instead of the worst 1, something like that. But otherwise, try to stay up to date. I tried to make it like a weekly thing just to get a right tempo at the same time. And last but not least, I'll mostly communicate through you guys with email. So make sure you check your email, because I find that Moodle, like I noticed this week when I was commenting certain things, that it was popping up like as notifications for myself, and then I asked my other group and they said to them too. So I don't want you guys to get overloaded by notifications, so I'll probably speak to you guys all privately so that you don't disable Moodle and then I write you through Moodle and then you don't get it, and some people get it. So email is going to be the way to go. That way it gets through, and I'll try not to overwhelm you guys with that. So if you have any questions or comments, let me know, and otherwise have a good day, and I'll see you guys next week.